Hi there, my name is Lauren Turner and I'm the Assistant Curator for the collection here at the Ackland Art Museum. And I'm very pleased to announce that I am joined today by Chloé Rager, who is one of the newly minted graduates of the Master of Fine Arts program here at UNC Chapel Hill. As for those of you who may have seen earlier videos, we unfortunately were not able to present the MFA exhibition that we traditionally hold at the Ackland this year. Its title had been In Space, Vulnerability, Invulnerability, which proved to be remarkably prescient considering everything that's happened this spring and all of the vulnerabilities that we have found ourselves exposed to. But we thought that it was very important because these are such talented artists who have put so much work into the exhibition to give them a chance to introduce their work and talk a little bit about what would have been at the Ackland. So Chloé here is actually someone who originally hails from Florida. She had mentioned to me before this that when she was visiting Chapel Hill, she got to see our Becoming a Woman exhibition, which had also been at your alma mater for undergraduate, which is not totally surprising considering we have some good, strong connections between University of Florida and UNC that had been co-curated by professors from each institution. But you also mentioned that you came down to North Carolina from Pennsylvania for grad school, and that other than being very busy the past 2 years with teaching, taking classes, making art, exhibiting, you also spent time renovating a small caretaker's house in an industrial area of Durham with your partner. I found this very interesting when I considered the infrastructure aspect of much of your work that we'll be discussing. So I need to talk to you about home makeover tips, definitely. But Chloé, thank you for joining us. As I have asked each artist who we've been talking with to identify sort of a favorite work that they have in the Ackland's collection. So I hope you could talk a little bit about that, and then we'll move on to talking about your practice itself and maybe how the two relate.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I told you that I really love Eagle Eye, which I just think is a really great piece. I'm particularly love, as a sculptor, I love light and I love materials and I love the way that it's being worked with here. The first time I kind of walked into the Ackland, it's behind this wall and I came around to it and I just was, full of surprise and just, oh, there it is. So I definitely think it's one of my favorite pieces.
Yeah, I too am a huge fan of our Namjin Pike. Unfortunately, it is in need of some conservation repair, so you're fortunate that you got to see it because for right now it's off view for a little while. Another work that you mentioned, which unfortunately we don't have a good image of because it's actually a film piece, is Douglas Gordon's bootleg Cramped video. And I didn't know if you wanted to speak a moment about that, even though you have not gotten to see ours in the flesh.
Right. Yeah, I saw another Douglas Gordon video piece, I think at Documenta a few years ago, and I just really loved it. And when I was perusing the Ackland works, I saw that one and I tried to get my own bootleg video of it, and just, I think it's super fabulous. The way he's using the camera and the that particular vein of conceptual art is one that I like.
Yeah, I long for the day when we're able to display that. The artist specs require it to be displayed at such a size that we actually don't have a projector currently that can handle those capabilities, but one day we'll get it out.
Yeah. I'll be first in line
to good to know. Well, thank you for identifying those, and I definitely can see some aspects of the Namjin Pike in your own work in certain ways. So why don't you take a moment to introduce us to your practice? I believe we're going to have an image on screen here of one of the works that would have been in the exhibition to sort of help with you describing some of what you've done.
Yeah, absolutely. So my work is, I primarily make sculptures, but I also do some photographs and some performance work. It's primarily concerned with infrastructure, architecture, and generally the built environment and the materials and forms that comprise it, and really looking at those materials and forms for encoded histories, power dynamics, how those things shape the world, and how we interact with them and how our bodies interact with them. So in this piece, I had used some of my own hair and this brass toe chain to suspend a concrete brick. And I mean, I just think that it really shows sort of the capability that the human body has, that the hair can even withstand that amount of weight. That's just really, you know, kind of awe-inspiring to know that you have such a strong material on your body, right?
Which I think really speaks to some of the tensions that the guest curator, Sabotage, was trying to underline in this idea of being vulnerable, of being in vulnerability, that while it can be perceived as weakness, you can also find strength. And I think this Blonde Wench piece really epitomizes that in one image, where it does not feel like that brick should be able to be suspended by the hair, and yet it is. This is something that we find in a number of your sculptural works, including some that I think we're going to pull up real quickly from your website, that there had been planned to be in the exhibition, involving you casting in these very soft, pliant materials the potholes of roads.
Yeah, so this is a project that I've been working on probably for too long now, because it just really, you know, got my research sort of vibe going, but it also was so satisfying to go out in the road and make these casts of the negative spaces of potholes and bring them back to my studio and then turn them into these, you know, pliable, strange, colorful objects that you can see here. You know, it's just I think it's a great project and was a lot of fun. To your point about tension and thinking about vulnerability, I mean, I just think there's something really great to think about in terms of making, you know, a negative space into a positive space, right? That we can fill these holes, or they can be examined in different ways.
I think it's also a really fascinating flip on a pretty persistent trend throughout art history and photography, is this sort of lionization of the ruin. And generally we're so preoccupied with what's remaining that we're not necessarily focusing on what's missing. And I really love that you're flipping the script there. I didn't know if you've engaged with sort of ideas of negative space in other ways in terms of infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I've been dealing with negative space and in general sort of the things that aren't there, or the way that materials appear to be stronger than they necessarily are. So there had been a piece that we don't have a great photograph of that was planned to be in the show, which was a large concrete slab that when I'd casted it, I'd poured half a bag of sugar into the concrete mix. And so over time, it was essentially crumbling because the addition of the sweetener, the sugar, had broken down the concrete molecules and, you know, rendered it fragile, basically. So, you know, working with negative space and positive space in a really physical sculptural way, but also in this conceptual way about the way things weaken, or they appear strong, or they appear soft.
I'm so glad you mentioned that piece, even though we don't have an image for it. I wanted to tell you, every year head of design and installation, and I learn new things from you students. And that was sort of the one for me this year, where we were trying to figure out if having sugar in the concrete would attract pests into the museum. Unbeknownst to us, but probably known to you, that there is a rich history of sugar in concrete, and we were definitely obsessing about the wrong thing. Apparently, it can be used as a retardant in terms of letting more time pass for the concrete to harden so you can work it, which I think is sort of this lovely metaphorical statement about how it takes a little sweetness to keep something from being in a firm, you know, unchanging opinion. But I wondered how much, in terms of sort of knowledge of these sorts of processes behind material and infrastructure, has been a part of your practice, because I'm sure this wasn't an accident.
Yeah, you know, some things I stumble on and learn about later, and I came to the sugar conclusion because I was originally thinking of other things to cast into concrete and actually how to make them hard, not to make the concrete soft. And in doing that, it sort of occurred to me that maybe I was messing with the casting properties of the material, and just started investigating it, and found, as you said, that a little bit of sugar is a retardant. And after I made the piece, I actually learned that throwing sugar into the concrete mix is an old French anarchist way to keep a statue from being erected. So, you know, it just felt sort of kind of, you know, serendipitous. And I think that that's tends to be how I find things. You know, you like pick up a strand and you go a little ways down that strand, and then, you know, you stop and you find something great, and, you know, you can pick up a few more strands, and they build this rich history. And I think, you know, partially that's just because I'm working with infrastructure and architecture and these things that do have such a rich history, that it's easy to, in some ways, to just pull things because there's so much in it.
I'm really glad you mentioned that note about the use of it for anarchy, because that's definitely a theme present in your work that we haven't really looked at yet, this idea of power structures and how they come into play. And I think one of the things when I was looking through your work that really struck me in terms of sort of epitomizing both the users versus the people providing the infrastructure is this idea of desire lines, which was a phrase I actually hadn't heard yet, but I'd love to hear you talk about and the work you've done with that.
Yeah, so a desire line is this area where humans form their own pathway. They essentially erode the land. So, you know, the city planners decide they're going to put a sidewalk, you know, down a median, or they just don't put one there, and people naturally walk and they form their own beautiful pathway. And I started taking satellite photographs of these instances I found, either through, you know, looking through the satellites or through just walking through the city and going, oh, there's one, and, you know, I should write that down and go home and grab it, and archiving all of these instances where, you know, people had essentially said, like, I'm making my own pathway, I'm creating my own infrastructure. It's this, I think, like, accidental anarchy that I really love. I actually have a version of the desire lines that's specific to Durham, which is up at CAM in Raleigh right now. So when we can all visit museums again, that's it.
That's wonderful. I feel like that's got to be one of those things where once you start looking for them, you never unsee them.
Absolutely. I think a little bit I'm obsessed with looking at the built environment and finding these little things. And I like it. It's my favorite thing when other people, you know, send me images and they're like, oh, I found one over here, or look at this slab that's crumbling. And I'm just like, yes, you know, I have folders on my phone of other images people have sent me that I just love.
So in terms of at least the work of yours that I was exposed to through what would have been included in this exhibition, I know that we're looking at a lot of things related to pathways and roads, and it seems very fitting when you're graduating from a North Carolina school, the good road state, or such as we once were. I wonder if you could talk a little about some of the other infrastructure elements you've been considering or looking into for your future practice.
Yeah, I think, I'm always juggling things that I want to do work about. I did a piece that I loved that I'd like to investigate more that was in my thesis, which was just a really small piece, and it was about overpasses infrastructure overpasses in the roadway, and the clearance height is related to the largest domestic missile that we've ever produced. So essentially all overpasses are supposed to be at 17 feet, and that's so that we can fit a missile underneath them. And I just thought that was such a rich, poignant way to look at the way the state and war coalesce into the built environment and shape these things that we might not otherwise be aware of, right? So that's definitely something that I want to pull more threads out of, because I think that the idea that we're sort of traveling along these pathways made for militarization is insidious, but also by learning about it and thinking about it, has the capability of subverting some of those tactics and that hidden aspect of infrastructure.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. One of the things that we've been trying to remind folks about this exhibition is you not only were in the works for displaying your works in this curated presentation at the Ackland, but also to exhibit your actual thesis projects at originally scheduled at Lump in Raleigh, and hopefully to be mounted this fall. Do you want to talk a little about some of the works that you were going to include in that exhibition? Was there overlap or?
Mm-hmm. There was definitely some overlap. There was overlap in the pothole works. I didn't think they'd originally be in the Ackland, but Saba came into my studio one day and she saw these, hot pink iterations of the positive potholes. And she was like, yeah, I think we need that. So some of those were in there. There was also a work related to the highway, and some photographic works that were in the background of one of the pictures we looked at on my website, but they're silver gelatin prints of instances that I found in the road of these asphalt faults. So the state has this highway repair manual that grades different asphalt faults so that they can look at the road, and they have these really bodily names. So it's like bleeding, cracking, just like absolutely bodily and strange. And I had paired the text from this asphalt manual with images of the road. And those works will be hopefully in a new iteration of what was to be in March, but got postponed.
So everyone should stay tuned for this fall to check that out.
Yeah.
I'm curious, you obviously have been doing really excellent research into following up a lot of just processes into how the original forms that you're looking at get made. Do you ever have difficulties finding that information, or are the manuals pretty readily available out there, or is this sometimes something that takes a little bit of legwork to find out the trade secrets?
I think it's a mix of both. It's easier to find sort of the asphalt repair manual, like things that are readily available to people outside of just state workers, whereas some of the histories are, it took me a while to sort of dig into. People kept telling me, oh, the highway is an industrial highway based on the military. And I couldn't figure out exactly how that came into fruition. And it took some digging in some of the UNC archives for me to make some of those connections. So I think it's a little bit of both. It's material information. Sometimes it's like calling my dad and being like, hey dad, this thing about concrete. And he's like, oh yeah, I think, and he kind of helps me out. So, you know, dads are great. Archives are great.
Anyone you can call for help is great.
Yeah, I use my phone lines all the time. Mm-hmm.
Do you find that that's something that was really actively encouraged in the program, to turn to archives and sort of that way of learning for inspiration in your practice?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that one of the great things about the UNC Studio Department, and particularly my committee, who I, you know, was really blessed to have to work with, is that they were sort of constantly making space for me to dig deeper and to pull more meaning out of things. And it worked well for me because of, you know, my work and what I'm interested in looking at. And archives are a great source for finding, you know, it's really interesting. The things that we don't know are already embedded in, you know, things that shape our lives, right?
That's wonderful to hear. I'm sure you've made a lot of archivists happy out there.
Yeah.
Well, I've been trying to sort of finish these off just to make sure that you all have the appropriate knowledge you need to enter into your full art making career now that you have your degree. So I have an important question for you.
Mm-hmm.
In Animal Crossing, my evil overlord Tom Nook keeps telling me I need to look into infrastructure. So do I need to build a bridge or an incline?
I say, that's a rough one. I say, I say build a bridge.
Okay.
Wonderful spaces of shade.
I will do that as soon as I've saved up the money, because apparently there's no government on this.
Governmentless bridges are the future. So.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Chloe. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I look forward to seeing what you do in the future with your practice, as early as it may be in the fall and even beyond. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.